Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Curious Coconut. Today, we are joined by Annelieke and Joey, who I met through the Climate Tech Fellowship that I did at StartMate. They're really amazing people. I've had lots of chats with Annelieke, and we all love climate. Today we'll be talking about some articles that Annelieke and Joey have written, and they're on climate tech and the funding landscape in Australia. But before we get started, I'll just get you, Annelieke, to introduce yourself, and then Joey, you can do that after as well. Just so our audience has a bit of an idea who you are, where you're coming from, and what your climate journey has been so far.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eddie, for asking. So I'm Annelieke, originally Dutch, as you know, it's pretty obvious from the accent and the name. I started my professional journey as a scientist in biochemistry in the Netherlands, and then went to research. Actually, what does it take to take research out of universities and into the real world? I ended up in strategy consulting with a big four and then a small consulting firm. Got more and more interested in climate and also in innovation. Moved to New Zealand somewhere along the way where I spent just under 5 years, and recently moved to Melbourne in Australia. And I am using this personal change as a catalyst to also fully pivot my career on climate focus. So that's how I got here.
Cool. And what about you, Joey?
Yeah, so this is Joey. I'm American, as you can tell from my accent. Yes, also recently did the StartMate Climate Tech Fellowship with Annelieke and yourself, and really enjoyed it. I have a technology background. I come from software engineering, systems engineering, in a few different industries, media and travel. So not part of the climate tech vertical, so to speak. But really, really an important topic and a really fascinating area to deep dive into. So Annelieke and I really shared that passion.
Yeah.
And I'm over here in New Zealand, so we made sure to grab the perspective of the Kiwis as well as the Australians as we went through this whole process.
Yeah, we're such a global community, I feel like, because Tong is in Thailand. Me and Annelieke, we are in Melbourne, and then you're in New Zealand. So we're like all over the place.
We're all global
For sure.
citizens.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
And I
For
guess one question I want to ask is like, what motivated you guys to pursue climate as a career? Because I think all of us, we're all really passionate here on this call about climate tech. But I just want to know a bit of your journey in climate.
I mean, I think it's such an important problem, right? And so no matter what industry you're in, you can't ignore the climate change problem. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all motivated by how can we do more? How can we be part of the solution as opposed to just another part of the problem? And that was what motivated me to get into the climate tech program, and what brought Annelieke and I together to write this series of articles so that we could just learn more and figure out, well, what are those areas that we can hit on that will help the most?
Mm.
Yeah. And for me, yeah, it was very, very similar. On one hand, it was almost a natural progression for me to, I started with a focus on agri-food and materials and circular economy. That quickly became an interest in all things climate, but also an understanding of just how big this problem is and how little of it I understood. And partly in my job as a strategy consultant, I was privy to lots of conversations between executives and board directors,
Mm-hmm.
who I thought were very often faced with an impossible problem where they had to either invest in a climate solution or in something else that was also really important and possibly more urgent. And very often they were just stuck between a rock and a hard place and actually not really able to do the right thing. So how I got more and more interested in the climate space, I also understood that it is so fraught with difficulty on doing the right thing that I really wanted to figure out how do I help? Where do I fit in? And what is actually going to make the needle move?
And I think a lot of people are asking that question for themselves as well, which was another reason that we thought it would be really important to, we use the phrase learn in public. We wanted to do something that wasn't just for us, but also something that could be useful for other people.
Yeah. And I guess that's what like made you want to write the articles, right? And to like learn, be on a learning journey yourself while teaching others as well. So yeah, I guess like tell us a bit more about your articles, and what you have done so far in that space.
Yeah, I can kick off, and I'm sure Joey will figure out all the bits that I forget to mention. But it's so how we started was we had this realization, or perhaps it was a question whether that was actually true, that building a climate tech company seemed to be just a tad harder than building any other type of startup, as if that wasn't hard enough. And we just didn't really understand why. So we basically had, we started talking about this, and we started kind of asking around, and what we got to were basically two big, I guess, starting hypotheses that we were going to test. The first was there's not enough money in climate or climate tech, and maybe one or the other, maybe both. And the other one was specifically if we talk about early stage innovation and startups, if that money would mostly come from VCs, that our hypothesis was that the typical software-based model that many VCs were following just didn't always apply. And we wanted to understand what does that actually entail, and how would it need to be different?
Yeah, I think to put it, just kind of from a different angle, does that VC funding model, does it work for climate tech, right? Or is there some systemic reason that is not appropriate? It was really interesting. That's a hot button topic, especially in the investment community across Australia and New Zealand, because there are a lot of venture capital firms that really want to be leaders in this field and feel very strongly that the model works. I think, not to jump ahead, too far to the spoilers, but I think we found that the real sort of point of difference with climate tech and other types of deep tech industries is actually to that software SaaS, kind of software as a service product model. And it's fundamentally different than that. But that doesn't mean that an equity-based financing approach doesn't work for that. You just have to be on board with the fact that you're not just building a website and then scaling to 1 million users overnight. You're solving a really hard physical problem in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we also wanted was to start with a slightly controversial hypothesis, right? Because what we wanted was to kind of, get slightly enough annoyance from the people that we would speak to to have a really fun, deep, and engaging conversation, rather than just staying at a very high level and not actually adding value.
Wait, so what was the controversial hypothesis?
Well, I mean, if I put it really bluntly, the hypothesis was your model doesn't work. Tell me why.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. That's great way to start.
We didn't actually say that in the interviews. That would be a little bit too Dutch.
A little too Dutch. And for the climate articles, what is your research process like?
So it's really about gathering a lot of different perspectives. And so, yes, there was a bit of desktop research that we did to validate the statistics and some of the scale factors and the numbers that we heard from different people. But what we really wanted to do was bring together the perspectives of different participants in the ecosystem that sometimes they're not in the same room together. Sometimes they're talking at different levels, or the community in one place is not connected to a community in another place. So that was really what we hoped to do, was to try and get a 360-degree look at what was going on with funding in climate tech. So, it was almost more of a journalism thing than a research thing, in that we wanted to make sure that we talked to all of the right participants. We wanted to talk to investors. We wanted to talk to founders. We wanted to talk to academics and universities and get different perspectives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think we started possibly with a very big ambition that we were going to interview like dozens of people in all of these spaces. And I mean, very quickly came to the realization that that would be fantastic, and maybe we will at some point, but we probably slimmed it down a little bit and here and there made some generalizations, but then made it into a question. Also, hoping to then engage people to kind of respond to that, especially if they would disagree. Which actually happened quite a bit when we posted our articles on Substack and on LinkedIn, that people would actually approach us saying, I actually have a perspective on this if you're interested, or did you know XYZ fact, which was really cool. And I think, to kind of touch back on what Joey said earlier, the learning in public.
Yeah.
I think this, maybe it's true for many topics or maybe every topic, but this is one where no one has all the answers. So just by saying, look, these are the perspectives that we gathered, this is what we think we know, these are the questions that remain unanswered for us, to kind of make it into a question mark rather than an exclamation mark, I think is a really good way to just add to that flywheel of conversations on climate tech.
Yeah, and I guess like the purpose is to basically get conversations started about these topics, right? And I feel like stating like an opinion, but like not like stating it completely as a fact is a good way to do that, because then it like invites other people to talk about that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Plus we are no climate experts, right? We don't claim to be. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think in all of this journey, if there's one thing that I would say I learned, is that no one is a climate expert, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's still like a very new topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, like so you conducted all these interviews, you had your hypothesis. What were some things that you found from like the research that you did and the interviews that you conducted? Like what were your interesting findings?
I mean, one of the things, and this is kind of related to what we were just talking about. One of the things that was really surprising to me was how big of a deal PR is for success in climate tech and for the climate crisis. It's the general public has a very wide ranging set of opinions about what climate change is, what contributes to it, what could fix it, and that's not it's not accurate, right?
Yeah, it's not
There
true.
was a survey done in New Zealand this year, actually, that asked participants what was the number one thing that you can do to address the climate crisis, and something like 60% of the respondents said recycling was the best thing that they could do, which is so far down the list compared to taking public transit and not owning a car. Using electric appliances, getting solar panels installed on your home, things like that.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how there's not been a lot of public education on this. If anything, there's been public disinformation and a bit of cloud of confusion raised around all the different things that could be done here. And
Yeah, like
yeah,
it's quite surprising. Like people still say recycling as like the top. I feel like 10 years ago, I would have like probably agreed and said recycling. But yeah, like now, especially, I feel like maybe it's just me, right? Like since I'm more educated, I expect other people to have similar like responses as well. But yeah, I guess like if I asked my parents like what's the best thing you could do for climate, they probably would say recycling as well, which is not very encouraging in some ways.
I think, yeah, it all nails down to education, as well as how the media kind of presents this issue and addresses
yes.
this issue, which can obviously cloud people's perception on this whole topic, or change people's perceptions on this topic.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point. I think compared to some other countries, the general messaging, both in volume and in, I guess, quality, on all things climate in Australia, and I think in New Zealand as well, is below average, I would say. But having said that, I did notice a few weeks ago that ABC News is hiring for a whole bunch of climate roles in their team. So, I would say that this is a message that they've clocked, that this is something they need to talk more about, write more about, and possibly do more research about. So, yeah, so possibly, people who want to make a difference, and I would hope that that's everyone, have some other tools in their kit that are not recycling.
Yeah, let's hope so.
And we're in a group that, is talking a lot more about the climate problem and talking with people who are working on that. And so there is a bit of insulation that happens in that kind of environment. And we think that, this is how everyone is thinking about the problem. And to kind of touch on the funding aspect of it, you have different stages of company funding, right? If I've got a startup, I'm going to need early stage funding. There's going to be a middle stage where I might be raising a Series A or a Series B or C. And then there's going to be the big institutional exit style funding at the end of this, where you're going to get bought by a corporate player, or you're going to, IPO and start selling shares to the general public. And in those early stages, you might have people that are in that circle, in that insular area, and can really get what you're doing and fund you. And there are a lot of firms like that in Australia. And it's great that there are, because it means that a lot of people with good ideas can get off the ground. But then there's this, and some of the folks that we talked to called it the valley of death, right? This sort of gap in the funding for startups after that early stage. Because and the PR problem is a big part of that problem, because how do you get corporate investors engaged in this? How do you get government funding there so that you have grants that you can take advantage of? You need the general public to vote with their dollars and with their votes to make those things happen. And if they don't have an appreciation for the urgency of the crisis, then they won't they won't vote that way.
Yeah.
What do you believe are the opportunities for Australia at this stage? Because you talked about the competitive advantages before. You were looking into the competitive advantages of Australia and New Zealand.
Yes, I think we were saying before we started recording that it was like, what are they bringing to the Avengers team of all the different countries fighting the climate crisis? What's our superpower, right? And that's an important question, because that is also how Australian companies will compete internationally, which is a big question. If you want to get international global size returns on your investment, which all of these investors still do very much care about, even if they are impact investors. It's not just about the impact to the climate. They're not running charities, right? They want to make a return on that investment. It just may mean that the impact lengthens the amount of time that they can wait for that return, ideally. And so, yeah, so then the question is, what are those types of companies in Australia that attract global investors? And people are still struggling with that question. I don't think that there's one good answer. We've heard a lot about the mining industry and the rare minerals, and the fact that Australia can be a source for those, and so can potentially bring some unique in the world manufacturing capabilities to the table, and also around power generation, either through solar, hydrogen, or geothermal.
Yeah, I think like another thing that Australia is really well positioned is as I think there's like a lot of agriculture. So I think one of the opportunities for Australia could be like agricultural based solutions or like biodiversity based solutions. What do you think about that? Like, do you think that's like a superpower for Australia or something that we
And
should
it's
look
interesting,
into?
and also coming from New Zealand, which is an agricultural powerhouse as well.
Yeah.
It's a very hot topic, and one of the people that we talked to indicated to us, one of the investors indicated to us that actually made it a little bit trickier, because
Really?
when you have a lot of momentum in a certain industry working in a very traditional way, that builds up a lot of inertia around changing that industry. So,
Oh, I
and this is
see.
maybe more in reference to New Zealand, where agricultural exports are a much larger share of the GDP.
Yep.
To make a systemic change to those to reduce their carbon footprint that endangers the amount of revenue that they're making has an impact to the entire country at that point. So it's a fraught, sort of situation. And now, does that mean that they're going to change? That they're never going to change, rather? No, of course, the industry is going to change, but it might drive it to be more reactive as opposed to proactive, because they don't want to fix something. They don't want to, kill the golden goose
Yeah,
as part
exactly.
of solving the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your question around competitive advantage, I think there's two types of answers to that to explore. One is the what, and that's kind of the what types of industries, what types of solutions will help us play on a global stage. And all the things that you've mentioned have been mentioned by the people that we spoke to. I think there's another part to that question, which is the how. And one of the things that Australia and New Zealand are globally known for is kind of, I'm going to say niceness and ingenuity, right? So we are seen as a country full of people who are smart. We have a whole bunch of universities. Within the universities, a lot of the research, specifically in clean tech, is punching above their weight. So, for instance, the University of New South Wales, I think, developed most of the solar PV tech that is now mainstream. I hope that's right, really. And so there's a lot to be said about how we do that. So one of the examples that we heard quite recently was in New Zealand, for instance. There's KiwiNet, who bring together the research endeavors of all, or at least most of the universities, so that they can collectively actually approach the global market and collectively build on each other's IP and potentially even work with overseas research institutes. And that also then crafts them a path into the market. So, the how, I think, is as important as the what, because once you have some innovation, the thing that you really need to do is to get that innovation to wherever it's going to make a difference. And if there's not that path to market, then you're going to be hamstrung. So I think collaboration, ingenuity, speed, those are all really positive things that both Australia and New Zealand are known for.
Yeah, and I guess like building that network is really important, right? Like, because universities you mentioned in New Zealand, like they're working together to kind of commercialize the research. I guess that's one thing that Australian universities can do also, because there are so many great universities in Australia, but I think currently it's like really hard to commercialize the research that's being done. So if we can find a way to sort of connect the universities to better commercialize their products, that might be an opportunity for Australia as well.
We dove actually pretty deep into the whole area of IP commercialization because of how specific that is to climate tech. It's really in medicine, med tech, and climate tech are two big areas where there's a lot of technology risk. If we had more innovation from universities, from research departments, then that could accelerate the success of the whole sector, not only financially, but also just in terms of the impact that we're having. And so there's a lot of thought going into at universities. We talked to a number in New Zealand, and there's a lot happening in Australia as well. But where they're falling down and where, what they need is they need more connection with industry. Two things, right? One is they would love more government funding as well, which was a theme that we heard pretty consistently across all of the industries. Everybody would like a little bit more government attention and government funding to help solve this problem that would help everywhere. But then the other one is, you've got this sort of push-based innovation scheme where university labs are solving problems to push the science forward, but it is uncorrelated to the problems that industry is having. And so if you had that connection there, then you'd have a company who would be a ready buyer for an innovation that's coming out of a university, and you'd also have the universities, doing targeted and directed research that actually is going to have direct impact on problems that are being experienced today. So, that sort of connection is missing in a lot of places, and would be a huge help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we heard in that vein was also if you bring those two big parts together, so the research bit and I guess the industry bit, what that does is it attracts overseas capital. And on top of that, Australia has a whole bunch of tax incentive schemes that specifically attract both investors from other states, but also from other countries to invest in a particular, I guess, collaboration and commercialization of specific research. So what that does is it grows the whole ecosystem. And as Joey says, that's we've seen that before in things like health, medtech, biotech as well, where all of these things require something that goes a little bit beyond a kid in a garage kind of figuring out a cool solution to a problem that maybe exists somewhere, but or maybe it doesn't actually. But
yeah,
this
I don't think you want to be building a fusion reactor in your garage.
Exactly. So this is, we're solving a problem that is built on atoms, not on bits. And that requires generally a little bit more understanding and knowledge of the actual problem, the actual science. It requires lots and lots more capital. It requires a little bit more certainty around the market you're going to kind of sell this thing into, because no investor is going to give you, a few $1 million to build a pilot plant. If you if you don't have an offtake agreement of something that is similar. So it is just a completely different dynamic. So, I guess to go back to one of our starting hypotheses, I think building a climate tech company, or maybe more generally a deep tech company, is harder than building a software company, because there are just all the things that are true for software companies are true in deep tech companies. And in addition, there's a bunch of other things. And a lot of that has to do with lots of money and therefore lots of risk. Turns out people don't like risk when it comes to money.
Yeah.
Have you guys talked to anyone who have made this sort of transition from research to the actual project? And if so, what contributed to their success?
We have spoken to some people who help people do that. So the research commercialization managers. And I believe some of them actually have that type of research themselves. The conversation was, I guess, more about the general enablers, not specifically what worked in their instance, but some of the commercialization managers that we talked to at Otago University, they did mention that the best way to do it is if you are given a big meaty problem from the industry that is very real and very annoying to them today, costing them a lot of money, and then have some science innovation that solves that problem right now. So that makes that pathway really, really short, because basically the industry is asking for a solution for their problem. So all these issues around market risk and some other risks that create lots of uncertainty, they don't really exist. So that would be ideal. However, the reality is that's not usually how it works, right? Usually it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, bringing people together, making it into a think tank, or maybe a do tank, or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of people are holding their cards a little bit closer to their chest. So
and I think in one of our earlier conversation, you also mentioned that there are not many successful climate tech exits in Australia and New Zealand, which is why there aren't ready models as in the software industry. There are no big Canvas or Atlassians that have successfully sort of
That's right. Yeah, we heard about Lancetech from everyone because it is kind of the most successful example of
The
that.
example.
The example at the moment. And we also heard exactly that sentiment. If we had more big exits, then that would show the pathway to other investors, and that would reduce the perceived risk to getting into this segment. And funnily, we also heard the sort of inverse argument there, which is it's on the investors to figure out their own appetite for risk, because and fair enough, there's nothing that distinguishes climate tech from other deep tech startups. It's all the same sort of capital profile where you need to solve some technology risk. You need to invest in scaling up, maybe with physical, manufacturing plants and things like that. So there's an investment profile that is pretty daunting, right? And maybe lasts more than 10 or 15 years before you start getting revenue. But that's what a number of big companies around the world have been doing for decades now. That's what Ford and GE and all of these, these old school 20th century companies that make widgets, that's what they did. It's only been in the last 20 years when we've had this software as a service model that everyone got, quote unquote, lazy and just wanted to have 15% returns, in year 2.
Yeah,
So
everyone's just
what's
become a
the
little
quote
spoiled.
that we kept on hearing, the Henry Ford one? If we asked people what they had wanted 100 years ago, they would have said faster horses, not a car, to get them from A to B. So I think there's I think obviously all these things are true, right? The perception of risk, the actual risk. But the reality is deep tech is not new. Climate tech is just the sexy rebranding of something in this space that does actually attract a lot of interest from people who weren't interested in deep tech for whatever reason. But there have been global big deep tech successes. So it's a little bit, and I guess this brings it a little bit back to the branding issue that Joey mentioned earlier. It's if we're solving a big gnarly problem, or maybe the inverse, if we don't solve this problem, then we're in serious trouble. Then maybe we need to kind of think about what return on investment we're comfortable with, what technology risk and what market risk we're actually comfortable with, and potentially ways to reduce those things.
Yeah, and I know you guys talk to a fair bit of like investors or like VC firms. What's their perception on like funding climate tech startups, and how are they going about this right now?
The answer is dependent a little bit on the type of investor that we spoke to. So I would say there's, I'm going to generalize a lot here. So there's kind of the, I guess, more generalistic or agnostic VCs or investors that basically say, we'll invest in anything that we believe is a good investment that makes us money. Climate tech is good. It is growing. It is less risky than some other verticals. So absolutely, we like climate tech. And then there's the other category of investors who have a specific focus on impact or climate or variations thereof. And I guess everyone agreed that this is an interesting asset class. If you look at the stats, then in the past year or so, most companies, most investments have actually dwindled a little bit, but climate tech seems to come out on top. So people have more trust in climate tech companies than in some other verticals. On the other hand, a lot of investors don't want to invest in a solution that just has environmental benefits if it doesn't also have a commercial benefit. So, and then it really comes down to how do they define that? How do they measure that? How, over what time frames, and what are the actual metrics? And on one hand, you could think about, so there's a few impact VCs, for instance, that think about embedding environmental and climate benefits in their commercial business model as the only way to go for that. And then there's others who might consider a solution that would mostly drive commercial benefit, but then allow that company to invest in something else or do something else on the side, or give a lot of their profits to charity to kind of make that impact. So there's different points of view. And perhaps another thing to add to that is the big unknown for a lot of those companies is the price of carbon.
Yeah,
so,
I was just gonna ask, like, how are like carbon credits sort of like helping this industry, or like harming this industry, and your take on it.
Yeah, I mean those are two different questions. But so
Okay.
what we heard, I think everyone say, is we are very reluctant to back a solution for which the commercial success is mostly or fully dependent on the price of carbon. So, for instance, this solution will only be viable if the carbon price is X, which is probably higher than what it is now, because that's out of our control. And I would say from Australia and New Zealand, possibly a little bit further out of our control than from some other markets, right? So I know in the past you've asked me, how do I feel about carbon credits more generally, or carbon markets?
Yeah.
So, I'm gonna say it is, I think in principle, it is a good instrument, or it can be a good instrument if it is applied and executed in the right way, which currently it's not. There's lots of question marks around verification.
Yeah, we could go into a whole nother discussion.
which is a completely different rabbit hole. But I think generally it provides it can provide private capital to projects that would otherwise just be completely disconnected. But at the moment, because the price of carbon is low, much lower than I believe it needs to be, it is the easiest way out for lots of companies who have lots of emissions. I believe if this instrument is going to work, other than the verification issue, that price of carbon needs to be X-fold, right? So all of your mitigation efforts and reduction efforts and decarbonization efforts need to be better, easier, and cheaper than offsetting the remainder, which for whatever reason you cannot change by buying carbon credits. You have to pay through the nose to do this, and not just the way that it's done now. But
yeah,
that's my personal view.
We heard a lot about ESG reporting and how we measure impact for startups, and one of the things that makes me think about is the idea that there was this idea that one of the VCs really pushed around class 4 emissions, which is, if you are successful, how does the carbon footprint of the whole industry around you change? And that's such an important concept, and it is tied into the concept of having a viable carbon market, because at the moment, a lot of competitors, if you're competing in a traditional industry, but you've got a climate tech startup, which is an area where a lot of VCs want to play because a traditional industry has revenue models associated with it. You're not having to make an industry. If you're selling a thing in a supermarket and it just happens to be a green version of a thing, well, you can bake it a little bit of a green premium, and you'll attract, additional consumers than you would do if you're just competing on quality alone. And that's great. That appeals to VCs, even these agnostic VCs like Annelieke was talking about, that are just looking at what's your rate of return and is this a good financial investment.
Wait, can you go back to like the scope 4 emissions a bit?
Yes, I am
just,
sorry.
like,
Yes, absolutely. So the reason that carbon credits can have a big impact is because at the moment, a lot of traditional companies that make, whatever widget it is in a traditional way, they don't pay for the externalities of their carbon footprint. And so they could potentially offer things at a lower price than that's where this whole concept of a green premium comes from. So I am a little bit all over the place with this. The scope 4 emissions is about how does an idea or a startup change the whole industry around them, and how can that be part of the impact that they're having?
I think
So
it would
if
be better like if we also explain a bit like what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are, just
sure,
for like
great,
any audiences that don't know. Um,
absolutely.
and like how they're different from scope 4, because I'm always like a bit confused on like what scope 1 stands for and 2 stands for and 3 stands for.
No, for sure. So scope 1 emissions are the direct carbon emissions that you make as a company.
Yeah.
So if I have a factory and that factory has a big smokestack on it and it spews carbon out into the atmosphere, those are my
Mm-hmm.
scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are about those emissions that you indirectly make as a company if you work with a provider and they have a factory that has a smokestack on it that is spewing carbon out into the atmosphere, and you're paying them money to make those things at their factory and spew that carbon, then those are your scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, so this is all like, layers of abstraction, right?
Yeah.
But it's important, and it's important because some ideas are really good ideas, but because they have an indirect impact on the climate crisis, right? And so you want to be able
Mm-hmm.
to weigh those ideas against the ideas that have a direct impact on the climate crisis, in terms of what's the right thing to invest in, or what's the right thing to do. Scope 3 is about the supply chain around you. So if you're able to make a thing that is carbon neutral, and that can be provided to people so that they can lower their emissions, then that's impacting their scope 3 emissions. So
Mm-hmm.
it's upstream providers, downstream providers. If you can figure out a way to not drive semi trucks around to deliver your widgets, then that's reducing your scope 3 emissions. And then there's this concept of scope 4 emissions, which is somewhat of a newer, kind of trendy concept. And that is the idea that you have an impact by changing the behavior of the whole industry. So a good example of scope 4 emissions would be you have Tesla as a car company that makes electric cars cool. And so
Yeah.
all of the other car providers start making electric cars because they want to compete with Tesla. Tesla's scope 4 emissions are all of the carbon reductions from all of those other vehicle manufacturers because they started making electric cars because Tesla was in the market. So it's impossible to measure, basically.
Yeah.
But it is a wide-reaching impact that you can have as a company if you can actually change the behavior of your consumer, or the behavior of the whole industry. And if you are an impact investor, if you're a VC firm that really cares about having a green portfolio, then boy, you would love a way to measure your scope 4 emissions as well, because then not only are you having because those will be huge in terms of the type of impact you can have, but also it means that you're driving change in the industry, which is, narrative is so important to all of these investors, and that's where people want to be. They want to be the change that they need to see in the world, and so that's why scope 4 emissions are really powerful.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And so you have impact investors that will want to not only assess the financial returns of a startup in their portfolio before they decide to invest, but also the climate impact of the startup portfolio. And so that's why measuring is important, and it is an area where we started to see the beginnings of some consensus there about what that could look like, but still very early days.
Yeah, and I guess like it's good that more and more investors, I think, are trying to focus a bit more on like the impact side of things as well, um, which will obviously be beneficial for the climate tech industry as a whole.
It is funny. It's all a market, isn't it? Because the investors themselves have customers, and that's their LPs, their limited partners that provide the money that goes into their fund so that they can invest in. And so if you can have that sort of impact motivation amongst LPs and amongst the sort of family trusts and different individuals that need to put their money somewhere to get a return to invest it for the future, then you'll see more impact-centric venture capital firms spinning up, and you'll see more funding of impactful startups as well. And that's all great. Like, it's all moving in the right direction. But I guess the question is it moving fast enough?
Yeah, yeah.
The answer to that is no, it's not moving fast enough. We need to move faster. We're at like 1.5 degrees already.
Yeah, it's going to be a struggle. But another thing you mentioned in one of your articles was like the BlackRock investing in New Zealand. Do you want to talk a bit about that and how that's like impacting the industry and like how like Australia is compared to like the US and the UK or like the Europe in terms of climate tech?
Yeah, I can start, and then Joey can probably jump in there. So, so look, to start with, that's amazing, right? There's more money in climate tech. There's more money we can spend on building solutions that will hopefully mitigate the worst of the effects. And I think it is an amazing signal that you know, a really big organization that does their due diligence very well has so much trust in New Zealand as a country that they want to put this much money in there to kind of make a change.
So quickly, what have BlackRock done? Like what are they investing in New Zealand?
Oh, well, don't pin me down in the number. I believe it was $2 billion US.
Yeah, I
but
think so. That's right.
Yeah, they've made a commitment to invest $2 billion US in the New Zealand market for the development of renewables.
Okay.
And the clean, I guess, bring New Zealand to 100% clean energy. Specifically, where I think this is going to make a really big difference, this is kind of touching back on what Joey talked about, this valley of death. It's that scaling up of solutions. I'm pretty sure they'll deploy their money quite wide. But one area that Australia and New Zealand are quite light on is that bit in the middle to kind of say we have this somewhat, I guess, technologically proven solution, and we've taken it out of the lab and we've tested it, but now the next step is to kind of scale it up in a way that it's actually going to make a difference. And that is going to create that currently is really difficult to attract enough money for. So, and I see BlackRock really playing in that space. The reason why I think I am a little bit hesitant is it's the question why does it take an overseas investor to pump this money into the economy? Why aren't we doing this? And I don't know the answer to that, but this is why it gave me a little bit of pulse. I mean, it is absolutely great. It's 99% great, and there's 1%. There's something I don't quite understand.
And we've seen that a lot with a lot of the companies that are at that stage, that are green tech companies. They're Australian born and bred, and they get to that stage where they need to scale up, and so many of them are relocating to the US or to Europe, and it's because that's where the customers are, and that's where the potential exits are. That's where the buyers are, the corporate investors, the BlackRocks. And so that means that this idea that could be ours to grow and to own then, you know, kind of becomes an American idea or a European idea. And it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, perhaps it's not bad, right? Because if you think about it, there's no point in solving the climate crisis for one country, right?
True.
This is a global problem. So perhaps it's not bad to have that a global solution from the start. But there are some implications for if a company is funded by an overseas investor and or would move their operations to another place. That has some legal and operational implications for what they do, how they do it, what boxes they have to tick, what metrics they have to provide. So there's, you know, this is not necessarily bad because it might actually speed things up in terms of standardization, but there's just a bunch of questions there that I think are pretty fundamental in answering how do we collectively, globally solve these problems. And I, for one, am very happy that, you know, whatever their other agendas might be, that a company like BlackRock is putting this much money into these problems.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And after all, right, just to reference your guys' article as well, that you guys posted 4 days ago, climate tech is a team sport after all.
Yes.
And you guys also did mention this idea of being agile. Do you guys mind sharing that with us as well? What does it mean with companies having to be agile to adapt to the modern society?
I think it has to do with the challenges of deep tech and climate tech being a part of deep tech, and that scale up that Annelieke was just talking about. There's a challenge to solve the technology unknowns with a particular innovation that can tend to happen in a lab, and that can tend to happen cheaply, as you know, as much as it is, you know, in terms of just funding some scientists, you know, some professors to solve this technology unknown. And then there's challenges with scaling that idea, and some of these climate tech ideas scale very differently than just a traditional manufacturing company or a more traditional deep tech company, because they might have different types of impacts in different regulatory environments. You know, like you might have a government that regulates the climate or the energy sector in one way, and so a particular startup might work in that environment, but it wouldn't work in another country. And you also have, of course, different ecosystems around the world. So you have different things that are needed to solve different problems. If I've got a great solution that's going to stop the melting of glaciers, that's fantastic in a country that has glaciers.
Yeah.
But if I'm in you know, I don't know, someplace in the Middle East trying to solve that problem, I'm going to have a hard time scaling that idea up from where I'm located. So I think that's what agility is about. So it's not only agility in terms of which problem you're solving, but the size of the problem that you're solving, because that will attract investment. If you say, I've got a solution to a problem, just give me $1 billion and I will have solved, you know, I'll have stopped the melting of all the glaciers all around the world. You won't get an investor for that, but if you can figure out a way to really locally solve a smaller problem cheaper, and prove the point, then that builds the confidence for your next stage of investment, which can be a slightly larger problem, which builds the confidence for your next stage of investment. And so this is really great if you've got a real innovation, and it's actually about being agile with what problem you're solving, because you might solve a really small indirect problem that isn't the real problem that you want to solve. But you can do it because you have paying customers this year, as opposed to in 10 years when you've scaled up to solve the real problem. And that's what we heard from a lot of investors as well. Like, that's what makes a successful climate tech startup.
Yeah, and I think that you know, the concept of agility, of course, is quite fundamental in I'm going to say all startups, or at least most. And I think it is really that. It's, you know, every time you hit a milestone or you scale up to the next level, you are going to find more skeletons, and there's going to be unexpected consequences. They can be both positive and negative. So I think the concept of agility is really about you know, remaining very flexible to kind of dealing with that, and not just dealing with the negative, but also capitalizing on the positive. So it's just maybe it's just a different way of saying flexible and creative.
Nah, I think I love the branding, right? Like, I think that's what matters. Like, agile for sustainability sounds a lot cooler than just being flexible. So like, if we can like follow the software trend, like, of agility.
That's right. Yeah. What is your MVP, right? What's your minimum viable product that will prove the point that your solution works, but does it at the smallest possible scale? Because that's the cheapest way to do it. No, 100%. It's the same thing.
You heard it here first. It's agility for sustainability. You know,
it rhymes as well. Yeah.
And we made the point that it's a team sport as well, just because it's cross-functional. Like, to solve a real problem that, you know, Annelieke used the phrase atoms, not bits, right? It's in the real world. You need lots of expertise from lots of different disciplines in order to make that successful. And a solution that might work at a large scale in one discipline might work at a smaller scale in a different discipline as well. So it's really important to be here. I'll borrow another software industry phrase. It's important to be open source with this because we are all facing the same problem. And what we've heard and seen in this industry is that because of that focus on impact, a lot of founders take a very open source perspective. They're not holding their IP really close to their chest and going, I'm gonna go dark and not tell you until we've launched. They're wanting to build networks globally and use that as a mechanism to scale up the idea.
Yeah, and I think that's where the concept of the team sport really comes in, right? It's everyone has a role to play, and everyone has to play that role. And that sounds different, but it's not. It's what it really means is we just need to reinvent how to do business and what the definition of success sounds like for those businesses. And that's, hard.
Yeah, hard problem to solve. But yeah, I think we've been going for about an hour now, and I think it's time to start wrapping things up. So we'll do like a general ending, closing stuff we do. But the first question I want to ask is that like a lot of our viewers might be interested in starting a climate tech startup or working for climate companies in the future or now. Do you have any advice for them that they might find helpful to find a job in Australia or like to focus on climate tech in Australia?
Yeah, I can kick this off. Look, I would say the best advice is follow your passion, right? This climate problem is not going to go away. If find something that really speaks to you and learn everything you can about it, expand your network, understand what is already happening and what are the gaps. And then play in those gaps, but to your strengths.
Yeah, I think it can be frustrating for people that want to get into the climate industry because it is growing at a rapid pace and there's so much need. But it feels like we're just on the early stage of there being hundreds of jobs, every week that people are hiring for. And so in that type of environment, that, the best thing to do is talk to people, find out what they're doing, find out what you're passionate about, go and find the people that are doing those things and get to know them. And that is a little bit more frustrating than just sending your CV in to a company that's solving the problem that you want to be solving. But I think we're still on that slightly earlier stage of the industry, is a slightly less mature stage of the industry. But again, like back to that open source mindset, everyone that we've talked to was so excited to talk to us and share their story and their perspective. And that's amazing. I just think that it's incredible how open everyone that's trying to solve the climate crisis is, because we need to be collaborating and communicating in order to do it. So we've got the right culture and the right attitude for it, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we need. If everyone's just, being private about this whole issue, as you said, we won't go anywhere in the future, and obviously there won't be any developments happening at all. So yeah, open source mindset. But yeah, we at the Curious Coconut, we're also really interested in the tech perspective. What is something that fascinates you about tech or the future?
Well, that's a good question. I think the thing that really fascinates me, and it's kind of like where my mind went, was Back to the Future. Maybe showing my age here, but it's
I've seen the movie as well.
Good. how technology will change our lives and every aspect of our lives in ways that we cannot imagine. But also how a lot of that is kind of unintended and positive. So one example is, people talk about using public transport and electric vehicles to reduce emissions. What it also does as an unexpected side effect is it makes our cities quieter, and you can hear the birds. And that has lots of positive benefits for mental health and things like that. So it's just how these things will really change everything we do every day. And we can't even imagine it at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like my answer is going to be a little bit cliched, which is I want to say generative AI. because of that exact point. Generative AI is tricky because it's got a huge carbon footprint as well, right? So there's a lot of work that we need to do there. It feels like, it's sort of we're solving one problem and making another problem worse. But the amount of difference that it will make for day-to-day problems and the ability to accelerate change is what we desperately need as well. So if we can direct that in useful directions, I think it'll have a huge impact.
Surely it can solve this problem by itself, right?
Well, or it can start us down a solution so that we don't have to spend so much time writing articles and establishing a baseline for where we're at, right? It can just summarize and then we can jump off from there, right? So it's like an accelerant.
Yeah, no, I was just watching a YouTube video the other day. It's like I think a AI powered like extension for Google Chrome, which you can use to like summarize articles and stuff. I'm like, oh, this is nice. I don't have to read everything anymore. I can just use that to kind of get summaries of articles that I'm interested in. But yeah, last question. I really enjoy reading and like learning about new things. Do you have any, other than your articles, recommendations for books or like any other like resources that you think might help our viewers or us like learn more about climate or just anything in general? Like it doesn't have to be climate related. It could be fiction as well. But yeah.
I'm going to answer a fiction one that's climate related just because I was thinking about this recently, but I read Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, and I thought that one was excellent because it is a fictional future history of how we solved the climate crisis.
That sounds super interesting.
And it was a really good read. And what was interesting was all of the different, blockchain-based carbon credits feature in there, and but as does eco-terrorism and a whole bunch of other, sort of interesting perspectives on the things that will get worse before they get better. But it also described things getting better, which is a little bit, that's nice to hear from time to time.
Yeah. I second this book. It really made me think about other things that I hadn't thought about before. But the book that I was going to mention is that really inspired me to dig deeper into, more the systems perspective of a lot of these solutions, but also to kind of write about it, was Elizabeth Colbert. So she's written 2 books, The Sixth Extinction and Under a White Sky. I think she's written more books than that, but those are the 2 in this category. And climate journalism, but done in such a acceleration, inspiring, but still hopeful way. I found as a really good. So she writes about problems and solutions and collaborations, things that work and don't work. And it really left me with a lot of knowledge about these things that I didn't know before, but also a realization that we just need to do more of this, and we need to talk about it more, and we need to write about it more. And absolutely a recommendation from my side.
Sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the both of you. I'll just wrap things up by saying please check out Annelieke's and Joey's articles. We'll link them obviously with our podcast, whether it's in our bio or in like the description box. Please have a read. It's great. Both Adi and I had a lot of fun reading them. And as always, please like, subscribe, share it with your friends if you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you in the next one.